When investigative journalist David Mitchell stood up at the National Press Club and accused Mark Carney of using his Goldman Sachs connections for personal enrichment, he thought he had found the scandal that would bring down a prime minister. What Mitchell didn't realize was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his journalistic career, and Carney's response would destroy his credibility forever. The accusation was supposed to be a journalistic bombshell. Instead, it became a demonstration of what happens when sloppy reporting meets meticulous preparation. In 4 minutes and 37 seconds, Carney didn't just defend himself, he systematically destroyed Mitchell's reputation, exposed his false sources, and delivered a masterclass in how real transparency works. This is the inside story of the press conference that ended one career and elevated another. A moment when innuendo met evidence, when accusations met facts, and when a journalist learned the hardest lesson of his professional life. Because sometimes, when you come for the king, you better not miss. Thursday, October 24th, 2025, the National Press Club in Ottawa was packed with journalists, political analysts, and camera crews for what was billed as Prime Minister Mark Carney's quarterly economic update. The setting was prestigious but routine, exactly the kind of event that normally generated policy discussions and technical questions about fiscal projections. But David Mitchell had other plans. Mitchell, a freelance investigative journalist who had built his reputation on exposing corporate corruption and political scandals, had been working for weeks on what he believed would be the story of his career. Through a combination of anonymous sources, leaked documents, and circumstantial evidence, he was convinced he had uncovered a web of conflicts of interest connecting Carney's current economic policies to his former employer, Goldman Sachs. The allegations were serious, that Carney was using his position as prime minister to benefit Goldman Sachs clients, that his economic policies were designed to enrich his former colleagues, and that his financial disclosures were incomplete or misleading. Mitchell had pitched the story to several major publications, but none had been willing to run it without stronger evidence. So he decided to force the issue in the most public way possible. "I'm going to ask him directly," Mitchell had told his editor at the Independent Press Association the day before. "If there's nothing to hide, he'll answer clearly. If there is something, his reaction will tell us everything we need to know." This was a strategy that had worked for Mitchell before, cornering politicians with uncomfortable questions in public forums where they couldn't easily escape or deflect. But what Mitchell didn't understand was that he was about to face someone who had spent decades managing financial crises, regulatory investigations, and public scrutiny at the highest levels of global finance. Mark Carney had been preparing for questions like this his entire career. As the former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, Carney had undergone some of the most rigorous ethical reviews and financial disclosures in the world. His Goldman Sachs background had been thoroughly investigated by ethics committees, transparency organizations, and parliamentary committees in multiple countries. Every potential conflict had been identified, disclosed, and resolved according to the strictest international standards. More importantly, Carney had the documentation to prove it. The event began routinely enough. Carney delivered his prepared remarks on Canada's economic outlook, inflation trends, and fiscal policy priorities. The first 20 minutes of questions covered predictable topics: interest rates, housing policy, and international trade relationships. Then, David Mitchell raised his hand. "Yes, Mr. Mitchell," Carney said, recognizing the journalist who had been a fixture at Ottawa press events for over 15 years. There was no indication that Carney knew what was coming, but his communications team had briefed him on Mitchell's recent inquiries about his Goldman Sachs background. Mitchell stood up slowly, holding a folder of documents that he hoped would lend gravity to his coming accusation. The room fell silent as other journalists sensed that something significant was about to happen. "Prime Minister," Mitchell began, his voice carrying the prosecutorial tone he had perfected during decades of investigative reporting. "I have documents suggesting that your economic policies have directly benefited Goldman Sachs and its clients to the tune of billions of dollars. How do you respond to allegations that you're using your office to enrich your former employer?" The question hit the room like a thunderbolt. Other journalists immediately began taking notes. recognizing that Mitchell had just made a serious corruption allegation against the Prime Minister on live television. Camera operators adjusted their angles to capture both Mitchell's accusation and Carney's response. The atmosphere in the room shifted from routine policy discussion to high-stakes confrontation. But Carney's reaction was not what anyone expected. Instead of the defensive anger or political deflection that typically followed such accusations, he responded with the calm precision of someone who had been hoping for exactly this question. "Mr. Mitchell," Carney said, his voice carrying none of the emotion that such a serious accusation might normally provoke. "I appreciate your question because it gives me the opportunity to address some concerning misinformation that appears to be circulating in certain circles." The phrase, "concerning misinformation," was the first sign that Mitchell was in trouble. If you want to see how real transparency destroys fake journalism, smash that subscribe button now, because what Carney was about to do would prove that when you have nothing to hide, accusations become opportunities to demonstrate your integrity.
Mr. Mitchell, you claim to have documents suggesting conflicts of interest, Carney continued, reaching into his own briefing folder with the fluid motion of someone completely prepared for this moment. But before we examine your allegations, let me share some actual documents with you and everyone present. What happened next was unprecedented in Canadian political journalism. Instead of offering political spin or defensive rhetoric, Carney began producing official documents, financial disclosures, and ethics reviews with the methodical precision of a legal proceeding. Here is my complete financial disclosure from March 2025, filed with the Ethics Commissioner and publicly available on the government website, Carney said, holding up a thick document. It details every investment, every potential conflict, and every recusal I have made since taking office. The first document was just the beginning. Here is the Ethics Commissioner's review of my Goldman Sachs background, completed before I became Prime Minister, which found no conflicts of interest that had not been properly disclosed and resolved. Mitchell's confident expression was beginning to change as he realized that Carney wasn't just denying his allegations, he was systematically documenting their falseness with official evidence. Here is the Parliamentary Committee report that reviewed my financial arrangements, unanimously concluded by members of all parties, including the Conservative opposition. But Carney's most devastating response was still coming. And here, Mr. Mitchell, is something that should concern everyone in this room who cares about journalistic integrity. Carney's tone shifted slightly, becoming more serious without losing its professional composure. These are the actual Goldman Sachs quarterly reports for the past year, publicly available documents that anyone practicing responsible journalism would have consulted before making corruption allegations. The room was completely silent now. Other journalists recognized that they were witnessing something extraordinary. A prime minister who wasn't just defending himself, but was about to systematically dismantle a colleague's professional credibility. Mr. Mitchell, you allege that my policies have benefited Goldman Sachs by billions of dollars, Carney continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone about to present irrefutable evidence. Let's examine that claim with actual facts rather than innuendo. What happened next was not political theater, but applied financial analysis conducted at graduate school level in front of a live television audience. Goldman Sachs reported earnings of $12.3 billion globally last quarter. Their Canadian operations, according to their own regulatory filings, account for approximately 2.1% of their total revenue. That represents roughly $258 million in quarterly Canadian revenue. The precision of Carney's numbers was making Mitchell's vague allegations look increasingly amateurish. Of that Canadian revenue, approximately 60% comes from investment banking services to Canadian corporations seeking international capital, services that would exist regardless of who holds the office of Prime Minister. Carney paused, letting the technical accuracy of his analysis underscore the contrast with Mitchell's unsupported accusations. The remaining 40% represents trading and asset management activities that are regulated by the Canadian Securities Commission and subject to the same rules that apply to all international financial institutions operating in Canada. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. Mr. Mitchell, if my policies were designed to benefit Goldman Sachs, as you allege, you would expect to see their Canadian market share increasing during my tenure. Instead, their market share has declined by 0.3% since March 2025, according to data from the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada. The number was small, but devastating in its implications. If Carney had been corruptly favoring his former employer, their business should have been growing, not shrinking. Furthermore, Carney continued with relentless precision, the policies you cite as evidence of favoritism, our banking regulations, our capital requirements, our foreign investment rules, have actually made the Canadian market more challenging for international banking institutions, including Goldman Sachs. But Carney wasn't finished destroying Mitchell's credibility. Having demolished the substance of the allegations, he was about to expose the journalistic malpractice that had created them. Mr. Mitchell, you mentioned that you have documents supporting your allegations, Carney said, his tone shifting to something resembling disappointment rather than anger. I'm curious about the sources of these documents, because they appear to contain several factual errors that suggest they may not be authentic. This was the moment when Mitchell realized he was completely outmatched. For example, your documents claim that I hold stock options in Goldman Sachs that I failed to disclose, but Goldman Sachs converted to public ownership in 1999, and partnership stakes were converted to stock options that vested by 2002, 7 years before I joined the Bank of Canada, and all of which were disclosed and divested according to conflict of interest rules. The technical accuracy of Carney's response made it clear that he understood his own financial history far better than the journalist who was accusing him of hiding them. Your documents also claim that I maintain business relations with current Goldman Sachs executives, but the Ethics Commissioner's review, which I mentioned earlier, required me to cease all personal and professional contact with Goldman Sachs personnel, a requirement I have fulfilled completely. But Carney's most damaging revelation was about Mitchell's sources themselves. Mr. Mitchell, I'm concerned that someone may have deliberately provided you with false information designed to damage both your credibility and mine. The documents you're describing sound very similar to a disinformation package that was circulated by foreign actors attempting to destabilize confidence in Canadian financial institutions. The suggestion that Mitchell had been manipulated by foreign disinformation was delivered with such matter-of-fact professionalism that it took several seconds for the full implication to register. When it did, the other journalists in the room began looking at Mitchell with expressions ranging from pity to professional embarrassment. What do you think about this level of preparation versus investigative journalism? Should politicians be expected to have this kind of detailed documentation, or was Mitchell just doing his job by asking tough questions? Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to know where you think the line is between legitimate scrutiny and reckless accusations.
Mitchell attempted a response, but the damage was already catastrophic. His follow-up questions about specific Goldman Sachs clients were met with detailed explanations of Canadian privacy laws, international banking regulations, and the differences between correlation and causation that made it clear he had fundamentally misunderstood how financial services work. Mr. Mitchell, Carney said with the patience of a professor correcting a student's basic error, The financial services industry is highly interconnected. Every major Canadian bank, pension fund, and investment firm has relationships with Goldman Sachs, just as they do with JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank, and dozens of other international institutions. The existence of these relationships is not evidence of corruption. It's evidence of how global capital markets function. The economics lesson was becoming painful to watch. Other journalists in the room began asking follow-up questions, but not to pursue Mitchell's corruption allegations. Instead, they were asking technical questions about financial regulation, ethics compliance, and transparency requirements that demonstrated their understanding of the issues Mitchell had clearly failed to research properly. Prime Minister, can you walk us through the Ethics Commissioner's review process? Asked Susan Delacourt from the Toronto Star, effectively offering Carney another opportunity to demonstrate his transparency. Certainly, Carney replied, launching into a detailed explanation of ethics reviews, financial disclosures, and conflict of interest management that served as a masterclass in government transparency. Mitchell's career-defining moment was becoming a demonstration of how professional journalism should work and how his approach had failed every standard of responsible reporting. By the end of the press conference, Mitchell had been relegated to taking notes while other journalists asked substantive questions about actual policy issues. The man who had come to expose corruption had instead exposed his own lack of preparation, understanding, and professional judgment. Within hours of the press conference, the journalism community was buzzing with analysis of what had happened. But the conversation wasn't about Carney's alleged corruption, it was about Mitchell's professional failure. The reaction from other journalists was swift and unforgiving. David Mitchell's performance today was a masterclass in how not to conduct investigative journalism. Serious accusations require serious evidence. Innuendo is not investigation, wrote Paul Wells in Maclean's. The Globe and Mail's John Ibbotson was even more direct. Mitchell's ambush attempt backfired spectacularly because he confused access to information with analysis of information. Having documents means nothing if you don't understand what they say. But the most damaging assessment came from Mitchell's own professional community. The Canadian Association of Journalists issued a rare public statement distancing themselves from Mitchell's approach. Responsible journalism requires verification of sources, understanding of context, and commitment to accuracy. Today's press conference demonstrated the dangers of abandoning these principles in pursuit of sensational allegations. The statement was unprecedented. Professional journalism organizations almost never publicly criticize individual journalists, but Mitchell's performance had been so damaging to the profession's credibility that his colleagues felt compelled to distance themselves from his methods. Meanwhile, Carney's handling of the situation was being praised across the political spectrum. Conservative commentator Andrew Coyne, typically critical of Liberal governments, wrote, "Regardless of one's political affiliation, Carney's response to false corruption allegations was a model of transparency and professionalism. This is how public officials should handle unfounded attacks." In the weeks following the press conference, the full scope of damage to Mitchell's career became apparent. The major publications that had previously published his investigative work began distancing themselves from his reporting methods. The Independent Press Association, which had employed Mitchell as a freelancer, issued a formal statement. After reviewing the circumstances surrounding Mr. Mitchell's questioning of the Prime Minister, we have concluded that his approach did not meet the standards of verification and accuracy that our readers expect. We will not be publishing further work from Mr. Mitchell pending a comprehensive review of his recent reporting. Similar statements followed from other publications that had worked with Mitchell. The consensus was clear. His failure to properly verify his sources and understand the technical aspects of his allegations had damaged not just his own credibility, but the credibility of investigative journalism itself. Most devastatingly, Mitchell's sources began abandoning him. The anonymous informants who had provided him with the original allegations began distancing themselves from his investigation. Several admitted to other journalists that they had provided information without verification, expecting Mitchell to conduct proper due diligence before making public accusations. One former source, speaking anonymously to the Ottawa Citizen, said, "We gave David some leads and expected him to investigate properly. Instead, he went public with unverified claims. That's not how responsible journalism works." The revelation that Mitchell had failed to properly vet his sources was the final blow to his credibility. Within 2 months of the press conference, Mitchell had effectively been blacklisted by major Canadian publications. His 20-year career in investigative journalism was over, destroyed by a single moment of unprofessional ambition. The Mitchell incident became a case study in journalism schools across Canada and internationally. The exchange was used to teach students about the importance of source verification, the difference between correlation and evidence, and the dangers of confusing access to information with understanding of information. For Mark Carney, the incident had accomplished something beyond defending his reputation. It had demonstrated that transparency, when properly implemented, was the most effective defense against false accusations. By maintaining comprehensive documentation and understanding the technical details of his own ethical compliance, Carney had been able to turn an attack into an opportunity to demonstrate his integrity. The incident also established a new standard for how public officials could respond to corruption allegations. Instead of political deflection or angry denials, Carney had shown that methodical presentation of evidence was far more effective at countering false claims. But perhaps most importantly, the incident sent a clear message to other journalists. Serious allegations require serious evidence. Technical claims require technical understanding. And professional credibility, once lost through careless reporting, is almost impossible to recover. David Mitchell's career had ended, not because he asked tough questions, but because he asked them without doing the homework necessary to ask them intelligently.